Stay tuned for the latest message excerpt from One Community Church.
This is going to be a continuation in our sermon series, The Uniqueness of God. And today we're going to be looking at the uniqueness of the kingdom of heaven. The uniqueness of the kingdom of heaven. And so let's jump right into the text in the book of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. And we're reading from the English Standard Version. And I'll begin reading. You just go ahead and follow with me. For it will be like a man, for the kingdom of heaven is like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded them and made 5 more talents. So also he who had 2 talents made 2 additional talents. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled those accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 more talents. His master said unto him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had the 2 talents came forward saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 additional talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Verse 24, and he who also received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not, and sown and gather where I scattered no seed? ? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be more given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, in the place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Amen. Look at the faces out there. I wish I had a camera out there after reading that last verse. So let me begin by saying this is a parable taught by Jesus. And this parable is actually in a section of the book of Matthew that is really dealing with the idea of Jesus preparing his disciples for his going away. He's really beginning to try to prepare them for what life was going to be like after he was gone. He actually talked about the parable of the 10 virgins just before this segment in the book of Matthew 25. And so he begins to tell them about the parable of the 10 virgins, and that sends a similar message about the master going away and then the master's eventual return. He's preparing them for him going away, but he's also preparing them for an eventual return. It's interesting because when you look at this idea of parables, this parable is really talking about the parable of the kingdom of heaven. It's talking about the kingdom of heaven, which is really significant because it's articulating to us that God has a particular economy. God has a place where there are constituents who live and exist based upon a different system. The kingdom of heaven. And Jesus is using parables to try to teach us about the principle of the kingdom. Now, we first have to ask ourselves, learn a little bit more about parables. What is a parable? Why are parables significant? And what are parables designed to do? Parables, in a way, are designed to disrupt your thinking. Parables, in a way, are designed to turn your beliefs upside down on its head. Parables are designed in a way to challenge the way you think and see about the world, others, and even yourself. Parables critique common mainstream wisdom. Parables critique the dominant way of seeing the world of the day. Parables oftentimes flips the script for my hip hop brothers and sisters in here. Parables turn your world view upside down. It's interesting because when you see how Jesus is using this parable, parables are often structured like this. It starts with a particular position that is commonly understood and accepted in the dominant culture. It starts with a particular belief. Then it brings into sight a contrasting view. And that new contrasting view often provides an opposite position of the dominant view. And at the end of the parable, what you typically see, what should be encountered is the opposite position of the dominant view is actually the real position of the kingdom view. So whenever you study parables in the Bible, Jesus is using parables to actually present to you another way of seeing the world. Kingdom. Now, if we read this text, there is a particular way of reading this text. There is a particular way of reading this text, and that particular way is a traditional view. But let me give you an example of some parables that I once recently heard. This is kind of a funny story. A guy named Peter Rollins had wrote some parables in his 20s, and here's a particular example of a parable. He said he was driving down the street, and he saw in the back of a car that said, if Christianity were illegal, would you be arrested? And so he went home and he started thinking about this idea of Christianity. If it was illegal, would he be arrested? And so he came up with this story. He said there was a man who was arrested and he was taken to court. He was in shackles. And when he stood before the judge and the jury, the judge says, "You are here standing trial for your beliefs as a Christian." He said, "Now standing here, we have evidence here. Evidence A shows that you are, in fact, a preacher. We have video of you sharing the gospel. Evidence B, we have your notebooks. We have your journals. We have your daily devotions. We see what you have been writing. Evidence C, we have your well-worn, torn Bible. And all through the pages are falling out. You got writings and scribbles and highlights all through this Bible. We have all types of evidence." And they said, "Do you have anything you want to say before this judge and jury?" And the man stood there, Tammy in his shackles. And the man said nothing. He was quiet. And the judge said, "All right, then, you're dismissed. Let us deliberate." So as they were deliberating, it was about 30 minutes, and the man came back into the courtroom. And as this man came back into the courtroom, he began to stand before the judge. And the judge says, "Everyone arise, stand up." And the judge says, "Of the charges that have been brought against this man, I find the accused not guilty." And the man was, his fear and trepidation, it turned to confusion. He began trying to figure out, what in the world? You have all this evidence against me. Don't you know that I was a preacher? I was a pastor of a church. Didn't you see my Bible? Didn't you see my notebooks? What do you mean that there's no evidence against me? And the judge says, "Not guilty." The man began to cry and began to wonder what had happened. And the judge said this. He said, I know you were a preacher. I've seen your Bible. I know you prayed for the sick. I know you visited those in the hospital. I know you counseled people. I know all those things. He said, but watch this, until you have lived as Christ has lived, and until you've given your body to be burnt at the stake, and until you have given your life for your neighbor and your family, you are not guilty of being a Christian. It's a parable. Do you see the contrast? And do you see the opposite opposing view? There's a Jewish parable that was interesting. Two rabbis were together, and the rabbis were always debating about this one particular Hebrew text. And the rabbis, one had an interpretation, another one had an interpretation, and they would always argue, and they were arguing for years. They were years, Carmen, years arguing. And one day God came down. He said, you know what, these two guys are going to kill themselves arguing about the meaning of this one verse. They're never going to figure it out. They're never going to get it. And so God came down and he revealed to them his meaning of that text. And all of a sudden, both Jewish rabbis looked at God and said, how dare you give us a meaning? How dare you tell us what this means? Who do you think you are to tell us this meaning? The parable is there is that the sacred text, there's so much in it. The audacity of us at times to think that we have found the one particular true meaning. The opposite in that is saying that there's so many different ways of experiencing the text, and sometimes we think we have a lock on one interpretation. It's interesting when you consider that these are parables in a different sense. They paint a picture of what life is really like. In his final parable that I heard Pete talk about, he said he was at a church one Sunday, and he started asking the people, he said, you know, there's a story about a guy who died and he went to heaven. When he was waiting to move past those pearly gates, and when the pearly gates opened up for him, he walked in and he looked upon the throne. And when he looked upon the throne, he was shocked, and to his surprise, he saw Satan sitting on the throne. And Satan says to the young man, he says, listen, if you want to get into heaven, you can come and experience heaven in its fullest. You can come experience all the joy of heaven. All you have to do is denounce, because your Jesus is not here. Your Jesus is in hell in eternal damnation. He said, so you can choose to go be with your Jesus, or you can choose to be here in heaven. Which will you choose? Do you see the contrast? Do you see the dichotomy there? Do you see how it creates some tension? Do you see how it causes you to maybe check your own values? Because for some of us, getting to heaven is more important than getting with Jesus. So that parable causes you to wrestle with what this is really about. Is your ultimate goal trying to make heaven, or is your ultimate goal trying to experience the love of God through Jesus Christ? Parables. And so this particular parable that Jesus is teaching, he's revealing to us a way of experiencing kingdom. And I'm going to have Justin, Isaiah, I'm going to have Justin and Isaiah and Lawrence to stand right here. The three of you stand right here. So let's kind of go line by line in this parable. So there is a master, a servant. The master has three servants. I picked these good-looking young men right here. Master has three servants, but notice in the text, go back a couple slides. Notice the master, one more. He says, for the kingdom of heaven is like a man going on a long journey. Now, let me just say this before I jump into my interpretation of this that I want to share with you. Notice now the traditional interpretation, you may already have it. The traditional interpretation is really about how God blesses those who use their talents, right? I mean, that is kind of a traditional interpretation. Am I right? I mean, most of us have been in church. We have been in Sunday school. We have been in Bible study. And there is a traditional interpretation that God blesses those who use their talents for the kingdom. And that's true. We're not denouncing that. We're not denying that. But I'm wondering if that's the only interpretation of this text. I'm wondering, is Jesus really trying to teach us that the harder you work, the more I'm going to bless you? I'm wondering if that's the message that he is trying to communicate. Not that we don't serve him, not that we don't work for him, but I'm wondering if the message is really about you're blessed, and when you use your gifts and your talents. As a matter of fact, the word talents that we call talent is not really, the word talent comes from this text, actually. The real word talent, Val, is a measurement. It's a weight. It's a measurement of gold or silver. It's a measurement of monetary value. The word talent is actually not about your gifts. It's really a measurement of money, of economy. And so it's interesting how a particular interpretation, our westernized interpretation of a word, can cause us to really go in a particular direction and conclude that that's what this is all about. Use your gifts for the kingdom and God will bless you with more and enter into the joy of the Lord. If that was the case, Joseph, your life will be just smooth, right? I mean, you every week you come and using your gift for the kingdom. Enter into the joy of the Lord. I mean, it almost makes it seem like the more you do that, the more joy you'll have, or the more you'll get. So I want to challenge that today just a little bit. I'm not saying that that's not an interpretation, but I want to challenge that because he says the kingdom of heaven, remember, this is in the context of Jesus preparing his disciples for his leaving and eventual return. So he says the kingdom of heaven is like this. A man is going on a long journey, and he called his 3 servants together, and he entrusted them with his property. So he says, Isaiah, matter of fact, no, I'm going to give Lawrence, I'm going to give you, Lawrence, 5 talents. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, let me say a little bit about the worth of a talent, Lawrence. You may not know, but a talent in today's money, measured in gold, is about $1.25 million. So I just gave you about $6.25 million right there. Now, Justin, I'm going to give you 2 talents according to your own ability. Now, that implies that the master knows a little bit about the individuals he's given talents to, right? It doesn't mean that one is better than another. He just says according to your. That means some of y'all can't handle 6.25 million. You might be able to handle 2.5 million. And then Isaiah, I'm going to give you 1 talent, 1.25 million. And then he says, so he gives them the talents according to your own ability. And watch this. And he says, then he went away. You see what I'm saying, Joseph? He went away. Now, notice this, the inauguration of this story is the gracious inauguration of his generosity. You got to get this, that there is an enormous, magnificent wealth that this master has. This is sometimes it's missed from the story. This man had enormous wealth, and he entrusts servants with his wealth. You got to get the distinction, the difference here. This is not just a man giving some talents to somebody, giving some $10 here. He gives enormous wealth, and he goes away. And the Bible says he who went, so Lawrence turned around. Lawrence went, and Lawrence flipped it. I don't know what Lawrence did, but Lawrence is smart. I have no idea. He turned that 5 into 10. Give me one more, Isaiah. And then the one with 2, Justin went and he made 2 more. Now Isaiah says, I'm going to go hide my 1 talent. Go hide it. Just hide it under the seat right there. So he hid it. So also he who had 2 talents made 2 more, but he who received the 1 talent dug it in the ground and hid his master's money. Now go to the next slide. One more. We could put it right there, Lawrence. I'm sorry, buddy. That's a lot of money right there. You just made, what's that, 6.25? So now you have 12.5 million. You took what, 2.5, and you have 5 million, and you hid yours. Now, after a long time, notice now, the time have passed, a long time. We don't know how long, but the Bible says a long time. The master of those servants came and settled the accounts with them. So he comes back. And he who had received 5 talents lets him know that Master, I took your 5, I flipped it, and I made 5 more. And the master says to him, well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of the Lord, or the joy of your master. He comes to Justin. He says, Justin, what have you done? He said, Master, I have taken your 2 talents. I have doubled it. Look, Master, what I've done. And the master says, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of the Lord. And then the one with 1 talent, Isaiah. Keep going. Next slide. He who received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter any seed. And I was afraid so afraid of you and so afraid of what you would have done that I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you can have what is yours. But his master said to him, you wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have no seed. Question, I want to stop right there. Notice the master is actually repeating the view of the one that he had of him. The master's not really saying that he's like that. He's saying, you said, right? You wicked and slothful, you knew, right? Based upon what you're saying, question, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with bankers, and at my coming, you should have received what was with my original investment plus interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away and cast into outer darkness. You guys may sit down. Go ahead. Give him a hand really quick, everyone. So let me talk about this a little bit. Let me talk about a couple of things that I want to highlight for you. This is really interesting. This has me thinking differently about kingdom. So the first thing I want you to see, Joe, go ahead and put that on the slide, the first link. Notice now Isaiah. Now, when you look at the parable oftentimes focuses on, there are some things that are commonly understood. So when you look at what happened with Justin and Lawrence, it made sense. They took what they had, they figured out a way to invest it, there was a return, and it was very common. All of the text was the same. Enter into the joy of the Lord. But then you get to the third one, Isaiah. And then you have something very different. And oftentimes we would interpret, the traditional interpretation is, well, this person was lazy, or this person did not use their gift properly. And so this person was judged. Now, this is interesting because I want to take a little different view, Joseph. I want to challenge that maybe what's going on in this text is that the master is challenging how Isaiah saw him. Notice how generous, how magnificent his generosity. Notice how overwhelming his grace was in the beginning. He gave millions of dollars away to his servants. He gave away what they did not earn. He gave them the ability to experience life in a way they could never have experienced outside of him. Notice the first two went and they lived life in a way that was a reflection, watch this, of how they experienced it. Right? They lived life in a way that was a reflection of how they encountered the master. Then Isaiah, he came on the scene and he says, I'm gonna hide it. And so I want to argue that the 1 talent dude, Isaiah, he refused to believe the reality of the owner's generosity. Notice how he had his own understanding. He had a certain perspective on life. He had a certain view of his master. He had a view of how the world operated. And based upon that world view, he refused to believe what he experienced. He sees the owner as a harsh man. He sees him as a taskmaster. He was scared. He was afraid. He sees him in a way that's a contradiction to who he really is. I think one of the principles of this parable is trying to get us to understand that kingdom is a way of seeing the world. That this parable is trying to get us, is trying to turn our worldviews upside down on its head. It's trying to teach us that this is a very subversive principle. It's trying to teach us that maybe the way you see it, maybe the way you think about it is not the way that it really is. He says, you've experienced generosity. And watch this, the messages that you get shape how you live. The messages that you receive. So this man got a message from the master's generosity. He saw it a certain way. He received a certain message. He interpreted it a certain way. And based upon how he interpreted it, he lived it a certain way. He hid it. How do you see God's generosity in your life? How have you experienced it? Has it caused you to think, Joseph, watch this, that the pie is fixed? Do you know what I mean by that? My kids sometimes, they act like food is limited in my house. I mean, they act like the pie is fixed. Do you know what I mean? Like you have a pie, a pizza, right? You have a pie. And they act like that there is a fixed amount that will feed the rest of the world from this piece of pizza. And so there oftentimes is an alarm when one child gets more pizza than the other child. Because they feel, because it's imbalanced now, that there's no more for me. And so there's a crisis in our kitchen. Do you live life that way? Do you live life as if it's fixed, as if that the rules are set, and that there is no God who has created the system, that there is no God who declares that the cattle on 1,000 hills are his? Do you live life that way? Do you live life as if someone offends you, that it defines your identity? Do you live life as if someone hurts you, that is who you are? Do you live life that way? He's challenging the way we see. I heard one scholar says that this was kind of like, that was called scared money. Scared money. He scared money in this text here. He was so scared that he felt like, I need to save this, because although I got it for the guy who created this money, that's what's crazy. His master gave him $1.25 million, and he wouldn't hid it as if he didn't witness his master giving his partner $5+ million. You see, his thinking was a fixed, scared, limited thinking. And Jesus is trying to teach us something here, that you can't allow the way the world has conditioned us to believe that the economy is fixed. No, there is a God who's sovereign over the economy. It's not fixed. And so he says, grace is about participation. Grace is about participating in the grace that you have just experienced. So what Justin and Lawrence did, they recognized that what they received was something that they did not earn. They don't deserve it. So what they did, they said, let me multiply it so that others can participate in this grace. But the other person said, no, I got to hide this. I got to hide it because I don't want to lose it, because it may be limited. But they saw it differently. I'm challenging you today with this text so that we can see the world differently. Grace is about participating in the grace that you have experienced. How do you live your life? How do you see the world? How do you think about your neighbor? How do you think about your loved ones, your children? How do you think about the resources that you have? I don't care if it's limited. Stand on the fact that the little that you have, that God can bless that little. Right? So the next thing I want you to see, he moves from this thing and he begins now to kind of, there's a message in this text that's about absence of presence. There's a lot about him going away for a long time and coming back that it deals with the absence of the master, but then the presence of the master in the future. Now, it's interesting. There's this theme that runs throughout this text. And as I said before, it's a theme that was intentional about the second coming. But I want you to see something. The difference here. I believe that the two that multiplied what they had the ability in the presence of his absence to experience his presence. Let me say that one more time. They had the ability to experience in the absence of the master's presence. It's how they saw it. Maybe this text is not so much, Joseph, about Jesus, the second coming of Jesus. Maybe this text about the kingdom is how we can experience the coming of Jesus every day. Maybe they recognize that because they have experienced an abundant generosity at the beginning of the parable, that they had enough of his presence, even in his absence, to experience him every day. Maybe we're thinking about this differently. Maybe in our prayers, we're asking God to show up, and maybe he's saying, I'm already there. Maybe we're saying, God, I need you to turn the situation around, and we don't recognize that he's already turning it around. Maybe we're always conscious of what he's not doing, what we need him to do, and not conscious enough of what he's already doing right now today. Kingdom thinking, Joseph, this is unique about our God. Kingdom thinking is a shift from lack and a focus on abundance. Alex, it's really a teaching us that we already live in the right now. That we can experience Jesus, we can experience God's abundant grace right now. Grace is the recognition that he's with you every day right now. And I believe that the two who multiplied had a unique ability to see that. They weren't necessarily waiting for him to return, but they were living as if he was with them every day. So how can your life multiply? How can your life be like the one with the 5 talents? How can we model our life like the one with the 2 talents? How can we learn to live every day by the grace of God and let that grace be the fuel to multiply what God has already given us to an abundant level in our life? Grace is the experience of God's presence right now, even when he may not be with us the way we want. It's a different view. It's like me looking at Camille's laying there, saying, wow, I need to be grateful. She may be sick. I need to be grateful, right? Because there have been people who have died from the flu over the last month or 2, 3 months because of the flu. I had a friend, he rushed his mom several years ago. One of my best friends, and we went to run track together at Central when we started. One of my best friends rushed his mom to the hospital. He went to park the car, dropped her off in emergency, parked the car. By the time he came to the emergency, his mom was dead. When he told me, it was unreal. And it made me think we need to be thankful every chance we get. Every time we can tell somebody, I love you, tell that person you love them. Every time you can say thank you, tell that person thank you. Every time. So learn to experience God's presence even when we think he's absent. Number 3. Now, there's a particular thing about this text. This is what they call, Joseph, an eschatological parable. And this parable, which means it's a parable that's focused on what we would consider the end times. That's why that particular last part, cast out into utter darkness, where there's gnashing of teeth. I mean, that sounds really scary. I don't watch scary movies no more. And if that was in a movie, I'm not watching that movie. I'm just telling you, Ben, I'm not watching it. But here's what this maybe means. Maybe this is not so much about a future judgment. Maybe, Joseph, this kingdom way of looking at it is about a present judgment. The judgment in the text could be seen as a missing out on abundance or joy today. Maybe what Jesus is teaching us is that if you don't shift, maybe he's saying that if we don't shift to a kingdom way of looking and seeing, maybe we'll miss out on experiencing God's joy and happiness and peace and greatness today. Maybe he's suggesting that the darkness is not a futuristic darkness, but the darkness is a darkness today, Carmen. Maybe present darkness is even worse than future darkness. Maybe he's suggesting that instead of living life in a stingy way, maybe suggesting that if we're living life in fear and living life for self, maybe that when you live life in a stingy way and fear and self-centeredness, maybe that's a form of darkness, which is a form of judgment because you can't experience the joy of the Lord. And that's why he said that, come and enter in and experience the joy of your master. Look at that. It was because they were able to see kingdom. That's all I'm trying to say, actually, Mom. I actually think this parable is revealing to us a unique aspect of God about the kingdom of heaven, which is really a way of seeing the world. So when you're in a season of transition, when you're in a season when you're trying to figure out and make a major decision, when you have experienced loss and you have never recovered from that loss, maybe we need to actually challenge our thinking in the way of seeing. Question whether or not we are processing our situation based upon a common sense worldview, or are we looking at it from a kingdom perspective? Maybe when you experience a setback, or you experience a loss, or you experience something that happens that is unfortunate, maybe there is another way of seeing that situation, and never let that situation define who you are. Because just because you went through a situation does not define who you are. Just because Isaiah got one talent should not define who he is. He is a servant of the master in this context, and he has received great generosity from the master. He should have been celebrating, shouting. He should have been trying to figure out how to let the world know he's experienced great generosity. Maybe what made him do that is because he was comparing himself with others. Maybe he saw his identity based upon how much more his neighbor had. What kind of car his neighbor drove, what high school his neighbors go to school at. Maybe he defined his situation based upon their abundance and his lack, and maybe that defined his identity and caused darkness already. Maybe his pronouncement of darkness was not really a pronouncement of something that didn't already happen. Maybe. All I'm trying to say, Joseph, is that we got to figure this out. We have to figure this out. There is an opportunity for us to see things differently. We have to learn to pass along what has already been passed to you. We have to learn how to give what has already been given to you. We have to learn how to recognize that something has already happened, and out of that abundance, we reproduce what God has already done in our life. This is what this text is really talking about, that we have already experienced a massive, extravagant gift because of the cross and the grace of God. There is so much we have already received that we ought to be shouting every day if we can learn to see life just a little bit differently. So what does tomorrow look like? What does tomorrow look like when we begin to see kingdom? Kingdom is a refusal to accept that what the world says about me is what it is. Kingdom is the willingness to accept that God is good. He's sovereign. He's gracious. He loves me. I am his child. I don't care how many times I have made mistakes. I accept what he calls me. He looks at me, looks past my wrong, and declares that I am his righteousness, and I am the righteousness of God. So wake up every morning. Live from that place. Live from the place, Carmen, that you are a kingdom citizen. And when you operate in the kingdom, there's a particular system. Because when you are a citizen of a kingdom, there is an acknowledgement that you have a king. And I believe these servants understood kind of prophetically what was going on here in this context. The ones who operated as if their king is their king. So tomorrow when we wake up, tomorrow when we go to work, tomorrow when we begin working on those projects, how does that influence how we live? When someone cuts you off in traffic, when they shortchange you at FedEx, when your overnight delivery doesn't get delivered overnight the way you wanted it to be, how do you live? How do you respond? When someone hurts you, has anybody been hurt this past week? Has anyone been hurt? When someone hurts you, how do you respond? How do you see it? Why do you respond the way you respond? When someone says something about you or does something to you or hit that trigger point, y'all know what, everybody know them trigger points. When someone pulls that lever, how do you respond? So there has to be a way of reworking. There's a book called The Power of Habit. The Power of Habit. I forget the author's name. Big yellow book with red letters on the front. In the book, I remember he talks about how habits, we talked about this one sermon, how habits have, habits are formed, but habits are actually initiated based upon a trigger, then a routine, then there's a reward. In other words, you have a subconscious level of things. For example, when if I'm driving down the street, had a stressful day at work, depending on what path I take, there are certain signs that may trigger a particular routine. Dunkin' Donuts, Tim Hortons, Wendy's, McDonald's. And all of a sudden, you start going through your mind, and here's what happens. Subconsciously, the thing is triggered. I get into a routine, and now that routine is not satisfied until I got me a double chocolate donut. Right? And then I feel satisfied. Now here's the thing. Here's the question. Can you retrain new routines? And so what I'm suggesting, based upon this parable, can we learn another way of seeing so that we don't have to respond like we've been conditioned to respond? Is there another way of seeing the world, seeing our situations, seeing our friends, seeing our family, seeing our neighbors, seeing our children, seeing our parents? Can we see our problems differently? How can we see differently? Jesus is giving us a unique aspect of being a child of God, is that there is a better way of seeing our situation.
This excerpt was brought to you by One Community Church. To hear the full message, please visit myonechurch.com.